Hello, I'd like to look at another topic in our discussion of extreme fundamentalism. What I'd like to look at today is a little bit controversial. It has to do with theology. We're not going to delve deeply into the theology. We're just going to cover it kind of a surface type of an examination. I'd like to get further into it later as we look into some of the deeper theological difficulties within fundamentalism. But today I'd like to look at the war against Calvinism that you find in extreme fundamentalism. Now, I have friends who are fundamentalists. They recognize that I am a Calvinist. Actually, theologically, I'd be defined as a Calvinistic Methodist. If you look in history back to George Whitefield, the evangelist who came to the colonies and preached up and down the American colonies, established an orphanage in Georgia, my theology would be very similar to his. Very similar to Presbyterianism, but not quite. I'm sympathetic with all other true Christians, but I would be Calvinistic in my theology. Now, I started out as a fundamental Baptist, so I've discussed some of that already as to how I got to where I am. What I'd like to look at today is why is there such an extreme hatred against Calvinism and Calvinistic theology within the extreme fundamentalist movement. You'll find more attacks against Calvinism than you will nearly anything else, at least in my own experience, as I have gone over what has been posted and written on the internet and in literature. I tend to find a lot of attacks against Calvinism, as opposed to even the true cults, such as the Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons, or even Roman Catholicism. It seems that the worst enemy that some of these people have are Calvinists. The reason for that, one reason, is that people don't really understand what Calvinism is. There's within the leadership of extreme fundamentalism, it is railed against constantly, and what is railed against is not what is actually taught among those who would call themselves Calvinists, but it's more of a straw man kind of a thing. And because of that, the people who aren't into the theological studies or examining it for themselves, take that as gospel, as they would in those types of churches. They don't understand true Calvinism, and so there's automatically a hatred against it because of it's ingrained in the system. People seldom have really examined it, but they oppose it. I found that in my own personal experience. So when people ask me if I'm a Calvinist, and I know that they're coming from that background, I immediately ask them, well, what do you think a Calvinist is? You tell me that, and then I'll tell you whether or not I fit into that category, because many times I don't. They're thinking of hyper-Calvinism or some strange idea which isn't true Calvinism at all. So I can just say, no, I don't believe that. But that's one reason why it's opposed. It's just simply out of ignorance. Another is that the system of Calvinism, the doctrinal system of the Reformed theology, what's called the doctrines of grace, or Calvinism, represents the greatest threat against the errors of the extreme fundamentalist movement. Whenever people begin to question the errors, as I did when I was involved in the extreme fundamentalism, when I began to question the errors, I really had no place to turn. At the time, there was no internet. I didn't have any Calvinistic friends. There was a Presbyterian church in my town, but I was unfamiliar with it. I had no connections with it. And I'm talking about an Orthodox Presbyterian, a Bible-believing Presbyterian church. But I had, at that time when I was young, I didn't have any connection with it. I didn't even know they were there. So I didn't have any exposure to it. So I didn't have these other ideas pulling me. So whenever I was having difficulties looking at the things I've already discussed, where I saw the faulty evangelism, some of the theology I didn't quite agree with, I had no alternative. So I continued in what I was doing, but just continued with those questions till much later when these things were revealed to me. So whenever you begin to question the things within Calvinism or within the extreme fundamentalism, you'll find that the systematic theology, the stability, the history that Calvinism represents is very attractive to you. You're going to look, if you have exposure to it and you are indeed questioning it, you're going to say, wait a minute, I was never taught this. Why wasn't I? And that there'll be a pull to it. At least I found that in my own experience. I wanted to check it out. What is this? These pastors who preach the hatred against it are finding they can no longer hide under a rock. That you can't keep this thing under wraps anymore. The internet has just exploded the theological world. As I mentioned before, I had no exposure. There was no internet back when I began questioning these things. So what was brought to my attention was either through magazines or through books or through the people I met. So it was very limited. But today it's everywhere. You'll find debates going on. People will post things, against Calvinists. Immediately you'll have a Calvinist jump up and say, hey, wait a minute, that's not what we believe, or this is why we believe what you're accusing us of, or whatever. There's that international contact now that we have in the world through the World Wide Web, so you can't hide under the ignorance of that anymore. You're going to have to face it. I challenge you, for one thing, this just came to mind here, check out the debates, especially James White. James White was a Reformed Baptist. He has debated fundamentalists before, in the extreme fundamentalists. You can look that up on the internet. Look up James White, look up the topic that you're thinking about that might be controversial, and you can find that on YouTube, or you'll find it in somewhere on the internet, debate that didn't exist before. So this type of thinking is a great threat to the extremism that you find in some fundamentalist churches. The bad theology of the hyper-fundamentalism, extreme fundamentalism, results in has bad results. There's consequences to that, and lives are hurt, and people are left in ignorance, and people want answers, and then they begin reaching out, and they find that through the historical theology that we find represented in Calvinism. That's why it's considered such a threat. What you'll find if you begin searching is that you'll find that the bulk of church history was dominated by Calvinists. You can't ignore that. As I mentioned in the earlier videos, that when I began studying her church history, I began wondering, where are all my other fundamental Baptists? The Hyles-type Baptist people, where were they in history? They frankly, they didn't exist. What I found among the Pilgrims, among the Martyrs, among the Reformers, all of them were Calvinists. They dominated church history up until the 19th century, and that was when we began to see great apostasy in the churches. And as this apostasy began to set in, then you see Calvinism beginning to fade as the errors begin to take root. So you'll find that, and you'll also find something which I found fascinating, was that the best and most thorough theological writings came from Calvinists. And I challenge you to try to read John Owen, and you'll find in his writings that there's such a depth there. He was one of the Puritans, or even Matthew Henry. How many of us have used Matthew Henry before? He was a Calvinist. His father suffered under a persecution that was against the Calvinists. So you really can't avoid it in church history. The great heroes of the past, such as Whitefield, Carey, Bunyan. You'll hear these names mentioned from the pulpits of some of these churches, but you won't be told that all these people were dyed-in-the-wool 5-point Calvinists. They just weren't simply sympathetic to some Calvinistic doctrines, or maybe held a little bit here. They were all full-blown Calvinists. You just simply can't avoid that. And the one that I've mentioned many times before is Charles Spurgeon. That he's always held up as a great soul winner. His sermons are quoted. His quotes are used from the pulpit frequently in extreme fundamentalist churches, but very seldom do you find from these pulpits that he was also a thorough 5-point Calvinist, and he preached such sermons as defense of Calvinism and free will of slave and things like that. So he was not by any stretch of the imagination anywhere near what we would find in these extreme fundamentalist Baptist churches. He was a Baptist, no doubt about that, but he was not an extreme fundamentalist. He was a Calvinist. So, looking at all this, this is something just to consider. Whenever you hear all the negativity, when you're hearing that Calvinism is a cult, and I want to get more into that later. I'm going to open this up again as some of my thoughts begin to fall into place here. As you hear that, try to remember that when they're condemning Calvinism, they're condemning the bulk of church history. There are no extreme fundamentalists that made any impact in history or in theology over the past 1,000 years. What you'll find throughout all that time period are the Calvinists. And let me recommend one book if you have questions about these things. A book by Arthur W. Pink, and this is entitled "The Sovereignty of God." This book thoroughly covers many of the questions that you may have, and what this does, you'll find, is that you'll have a completely new idea as to who this God is you worship. And Pink was a fundamentalist. He was a dispensationalist, and he became, as he progressed in his theology, he became a Calvinist. He adopted a reformed way of thinking, and you'll find that in this book, and I highly recommend it. Now, what you're going to find if you're in one of these churches, these extreme fundamentalist churches, your pastor will not appreciate you reading this book. This is a very dangerous book for those who have questions about the extreme fundamentalist theology and whatnot. But it is just packed full of good material that you can read, and it will give you a lot of questions that I believe will answer a lot of questions, but also perhaps give you more questions. Once again, I'd recommend if you have questions concerning this to leave a comment in the comment section, and I'll do my best to answer that. I do appreciate your time and the opportunity to speak to you.